In the Arizona territory, a choice can echo like a gunshot, changing everything forever. For Abigail Reed, a widow at the edge of the world, that gunshot was just the first in a war she never knew she was fighting. She had her late husband's rifle, a small homestead he'd called Reed's Hope, and a memory she was trying not to bury along with him. When she saw the Apache boy sinking into the earth, being swallowed alive by quicksand, every instinct, every lesson of survival, screamed at her to run. Helping him could mean a war party burning her home to the ground. Leaving him meant letting the last piece of her own soul die with him. She made her choice, hauling the boy from a muddy grave with the last of her strength. But what came to her door 3 days later wasn't just a war party. It was something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The sun in the summer of 1878 was a merciless hammer. It beat down on the hard-packed earth, baking the life out of anything that couldn't find a sliver of shade. For Abigail Reed, it was just another day of trying to keep Reed's hope from turning to dust. The homestead, nestled in a shallow valley, had one thing going for it: a creek that ran clear and cold. That creek wasn't just water, it was life. Jedediah had been gone 2 years, taken by a fever that moved like a wildfire. Since then, Abigail had learned the hard language of solitude. Her hands, once soft enough for needlepoint, were now calloused and capable. She could mend a fence, sight a rifle, and read the sky for rain better than most men. Loneliness was a quiet ache in her chest, but she lived with it, the same way she lived with the heat and the constant, unnerving rattle of snakes in the brush. This afternoon, she was checking the fence posts along the north pasture, where the creek bed widened into a sandy wash. The air was thick, still. The only sound was the buzz of insects and the soft thud of her horse's hooves. And that's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A faint, desperate cry, thin and sharp, almost like a hawk, but unmistakably human. Her hand went instinctively to the Winchester rifle in its scabbard. Out here, any unexpected sound was a threat. She slid off her horse, Dust Devil, tying him to a gnarled mesquite tree. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her boots making no sound on the sandy soil. She crept to the edge of the wash, peered over a cluster of sun-bleached rocks, and her heart stopped cold. Down in the wash was a boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with skin the color of rich earth and straight black hair falling across his brow. An Apache. But that wasn't what made her breath catch in her throat. He was trapped, sunk to his chest, in a shimmering patch of wet sand. Quicksand. His small arms flailed, each panicked movement dragging him deeper into the greedy earth. Every cautionary tale Jedediah had ever told her screamed at her to turn back. An Apache boy meant an Apache family was nearby. Interfering was an invitation to a world of trouble she couldn't handle. To them, she was an intruder, a trespasser on lands that had been theirs for generations. She could get on her horse and ride away. No one would ever know. The desert would keep her secret. But as she watched his struggles weaken, his cries turning to terrified whimpers, she didn't see an Apache. She didn't see a threat. She saw a child, facing a lonely, horrifying death. In his dark, frightened eyes, she saw the universal fear of being consumed, of being forgotten. A fear she knew all too well. Damn it all, she muttered to the uncaring sky. She couldn't walk away. Her soul wouldn't bear the weight of it. Her mind raced, the rope on her saddle. She needed an anchor. A dead, sun-bleached cottonwood branch lay nearby, long and sturdy. It would have to do. She scrambled back to Dust Devil, her fingers uncoiling the lariat with practiced speed. She dragged the heavy branch to the edge of the wash. "Hey, boy," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Don't struggle. Stay still." The boy froze, his wide eyes locking onto hers. They were filled with terror, now mixed with a sharp, deep suspicion. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her tone. She tied one end of the rope around the branch, burying it in the firmer sand. Taking the other end, she cautiously moved along the edge of the quicksand, the ground beneath her feet feeling dangerously soft. "I'm going to throw you the rope," she said slowly. "You grab it. You hear me? Grab it tight." She swung the lariat and let it fly. It landed just short. The boy just stared. "All right, Abigail, get a hold of yourself," she chided. She pulled the heavy mud-caked rope back, coiled it again, took a deep breath, and threw with every ounce of her strength. This time the loop landed perfectly over his head and shoulders. She shouted, using her hands to show him. "Put it under your arms! Under your arms!" He seemed to understand, working the rope down his body. Abigail ran back to the anchor, pulled the rope taut, and braced herself. "Okay, son. On 3, she grunted, digging her heels into the ground. Her muscles screamed in protest. The suction of the quicksand was immense. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sickening slurp, the boy moved an inch. It was torturous work. Pull, brace, gain a few inches, repeat. Sweat stung her eyes and her lungs burned. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his legs came free. He was covered in a thick, gray cocoon of mud, but he was out. He lay on the firmer sand, exhausted and trembling. Abigail collapsed, her own body shaking with adrenaline. She had done it. She had saved him. And that's when the real danger began. She pushed herself to her feet and cautiously approached him. He flinched, scrambling backward until his back hit a rock. The fear in his eyes was a raw, primal thing. She held up her empty hands, her heart pounding against her ribs. What in God's name had she just done? The boy's terror was a wall between them, thick and impenetrable. "It's all right," she said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." She backed away slowly, giving him space, and walked to her horse. From her canteen, she poured water onto a clean rag. Holding it out, she approached again, kneeling a good 10 feet away and placing the wet rag on a flat rock between them. Then she retreated. For a long minute, he just watched her, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. His eyes darted from her face to the rag, to the vast empty landscape. He was looking for his people. So was Abigail. Every rustle of wind in the sagebrush sent a jolt of anxiety through her. Finally, driven by thirst, the boy crept forward. He snatched the rag and retreated, squeezing the precious drops of water into his mouth before wiping the caked mud from his face. Abigail knew she couldn't leave him here. He was shoeless and exhausted. She gestured toward her horse, then to the thin ribbon of smoke from her homestead in the distance. "Come on," she urged. "Water. Food." He stared, uncomprehending. She pantomimed drinking and eating. A flicker of understanding crossed his face, but the suspicion remained. He wouldn't move. Resigned, Abigail swung into her saddle. She couldn't force him. She nudged her horse into a slow walk, not looking back, though every nerve in her body screamed to. After 50 yards, she risked a glance over her shoulder. He was on his feet, a small, solitary figure watching her. Then, hesitantly, he began to follow, keeping his distance. That journey back was the longest mile of Abigail's life. She felt 100 unseen eyes on her back, leading an Apache child to her home, her only sanctuary. It was an act of pure madness. When they arrived, the boy stopped at the edge of the cleared yard, refusing to come any closer. Abigail understood. He was on enemy territory. She unsaddled Dust Devil, her movements a study in forced calm. Inside, she left the door open, ladling cool water into a tin cup and placing it on the porch edge. She did the same with a piece of cornbread. Then she went about her chores, pretending an indifference she did not feel, acutely aware of the small watcher at the edge of her world. Hours passed. The sun began to set. The boy had eventually crept forward to retrieve the water and food, retreating to the shadows of the barn. As twilight bled into darkness, a new problem arose. He would not come inside. She brought out a thick wool blanket, one of Jedediah's old ones, and left it on the porch. Then she went inside, barred the door, and sat at her kitchen table, her rifle across her lap. Sometime in the dead of night, she heard a floorboard creak on the porch. Her knuckles went white on the rifle stock. She held her breath, listening. A soft rustling, then silence. Peering through a crack in the curtains, she saw the blanket was gone. A sliver of relief was quickly replaced by a cold dread. He was still here, which meant his family didn't know where he was. And when they came looking, what would they think when they found their son's tracks leading directly to the white woman's cabin? The next day passed in much the same way, a silent dance of offering and acceptance. Late that afternoon, the real trouble arrived. But it wasn't the kind she expected. It came in the form of two riders, kicking up a plume of dust that announced their approach long before they were visible. Abigail's stomach turned to ice. She recognized the brand on the lead horse. It belonged to Silas Croft, a ruthless cattle baron who wanted her land and, more importantly, her water. The two men who reined in their horses at her fence were not friendly neighbors. The one in the lead was Beau Garrett, Croft's foreman, a man with a cruel twist to his mouth and cold, dead eyes. "Afternoon, Widow Reed," Garrett drawled, his eyes sweeping over her property with undisguised contempt. "Garrett," Abigail said, her voice flat. She stood on her porch, her hand resting inches from the rifle leaning against the doorframe. "Mr. Croft sent us to see if you'd reconsidered his generous offer," he said with a smirk. "This is a hard life for a woman alone. My answer is the same. This land is not for sale." Garrett's smirk vanished. "That's a shame. Things have a way of happening out here. Fences get cut, wells get fouled. A lone woman might find herself in a peck of trouble." It was a threat, thin as a whisper and sharp as a razor. "Are you threatening me, Garrett?" He chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "Just stating facts, ma'am. You're sitting on the best water source in this valley, and Mr. Croft is a man who gets what he wants." His eyes suddenly narrowed, looking past her toward the barn. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. The boy had been exploring the tack room. "You got company?" Garrett asked, his eyes suddenly sharp with interest. "My business is my own," Abigail said, moving to block his view. Garrett's gaze lingered for a moment longer, then he shrugged. "Have it your way, but you think on what I said. Mr. Croft's patience is wearing thin." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy sense of menace in the air. Abigail leaned against the porch post, her knees weak. She now had two fires to fight. She looked toward the barn. The boy peeked out from behind the door, his eyes wide. He had heard the aggressive tone, seen the hostile posture of the men. For the first time, he looked at her not with suspicion, but with something else. A shared understanding of a common threat. The wall between them had just developed its first crack. But Garrett had seen something. She was sure of it. A flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. He hadn't said what, but a seed of suspicion had been planted in his cold mind. And Abigail knew that men like Garrett let suspicions grow into violent certainties. The third morning dawned hot and heavy. The boy had recovered his strength. The haunted look was replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He seemed to be studying everything she did. She had spent another sleepless night, Garrett's threat hanging over the homestead like a vulture. Silas Croft was a patient predator, and his patience was running out. Reed's hope was the last holdout, all because of the creek Jedediah had fought so hard to secure. She had to try to communicate with the boy again. His people would be searching, and every hour increased the danger. She found him on the porch, whittling a small piece of wood with a sharp stone. She sat on the top step, a careful distance away. "They'll be looking for you," she said, pointing to the distant mountains and making a walking motion with her fingers. "Your family." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "You need to go home," she said, her voice laced with a strange mix of urgency and regret. His silent presence had, in a strange way, eased the crushing weight of her solitude. He held up the piece of wood. He had carved a bird, a hawk, its wings slightly spread. He held it out to her. Abigail hesitated, then took it. The wood was smooth and warm from his hands. It was a thank you, an acknowledgement, a truce. A lump formed in her throat. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He stood up then, his decision made. His dark eyes met hers directly for the first time, without fear. He gave a single solemn nod. Then he turned and pointed toward a series of jagged, sun-scorched mesas to the northeast. "Home." Abigail nodded. She packed a small bundle for him, a canteen of water, jerky, cornbread. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. It was the first time they had touched since the quicksand. He accepted the bundle, and with one last look, turned and walked away. He didn't run, but moved with a steady, purposeful stride, growing smaller and smaller against the vast backdrop of the desert until he was gone. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. The homestead felt empty again, but this time the emptiness was tinged with a new kind of dread. She clutched the small wooden hawk. She knew what his return to his people meant. Soon they would know his story. They would know a white woman had found him. They would know where she lived. Would they see it as a rescue or an abduction, a kindness or a trap? That night the answer came, but not from the Apache. A flicker of orange against the dark wood of the barn wall woke her from a fitful doze. Fire. She grabbed her rifle, her mind snapping into sharp focus. She burst out the cabin door to see a single figure silhouetted against the growing flames, splashing oil onto the dry timber. Not Garrett's whole crew. A lone arsonist sent to deliver a final warning. "Get away from there," she screamed, raising the Winchester. The figure startled, turned, and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Abigail worked frantically, using horse blankets and precious water from the trough to beat back the flames. The fire had taken hold of a corner post, but she managed to smother it before it could consume the whole structure. Her heart hammered in her chest, coughing from the smoke. Croft wasn't waiting anymore. The next morning, as she inspected the charred wood, she found tracks, the arsonist's heavy boot prints. But there were other tracks too, moccasins, and something else. A drag mark as if something heavy had been pulled away into the brush. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She followed the tracks, her rifle ready. Not 50 yards from her homestead, tucked behind a rocky outcrop, she found him. The arsonist. He was dead. His throat had been cut with a brutal efficiency that was not the work of a settler. In the dust beside his body was a single, spent rifle cartridge. Abigail stared, her mind reeling. It wasn't her bullet. She hadn't fired a shot. An Apache scout. Had they been watching her all along? Were they protecting her? Or was this a warning of a different kind? A message that this was their land, and they would deal with trespassers, all trespassers, in their own way. She was caught in the middle of something she couldn't comprehend. Now she looked to the horizon with a double terror. She watched for the dust of Croft's men, coming for revenge. And she watched for the dust of the Apache, coming for reasons she could no longer even guess at. She had rescued a life, but she was now certain she had forfeited her own. The question was no longer if they would come, but who would get to her first. The third day after the boy left arrived with a sky the color of pale ash. The air was still, oppressive. It was just past noon when she saw it. A smudge against the northeastern horizon. Not a dust devil. It was a rising cloud of ochre dust, too wide, too dense for a handful of riders. It was a multitude. This was it. She ran inside, slamming the heavy bar across the door, her hands trembling. She checked the loads in her Winchester and her Colt. What was the plan? There was no plan. She was one woman in a wooden cabin against a tribe. The dust cloud resolved into individual figures, dozens of them. They moved with a slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial pace, fanning out as they drew closer, a silent, sweeping crescent of warriors that cut her off from the world. There were at least 50 of them, their faces grim, armed with bows, lances, and rifles. They stopped just beyond her fence line and just sat on their horses, watching the cabin. The silence was absolute and more terrifying than any war cry. Abigail pressed herself against the wall, her knuckles white on her rifle. This was how it ended. Killed on her own land because of a kindness that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Then, one rider broke from the line. He rode forward slowly. He was older than the others, his face a road map of hard years, his presence radiating undeniable authority. He carried a single, feather-adorned lance. As he drew closer, Abigail saw a small figure riding beside him on a smaller pony. Her breath caught. It was the boy. He was dressed in clean buckskins, his hair neatly braided. He looked healthy. He looked home. The lead warrior, his father, reined in his horse 20 yards from her porch. His gaze swept over the cabin, the barn, with its fresh scorch mark, before settling on the window where he must have known she was hiding. Abigail knew she had a choice. Die a coward in her wooden box, or die on her feet. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she leaned her rifle against the wall, unbarred the door, and stepped out onto the porch. She stood there, unarmed, her hands held loosely at her sides. The warrior watched her, his expression unchanging. Then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, in the fluid, guttural tongue of the Apache. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly. I don't understand," she whispered, her throat dry. The warrior's gaze flickered to his son. The boy urged his pony forward. He pointed to his own chest. "Nantan," he said, his voice clear. Then he pointed to the imposing warrior. "Kalen." He paused, then added a word he must have learned from a trader. "Father." His father, the leader of this terrifying force. Kalen dismounted and walked toward her. He stopped at the foot of her porch steps. His eyes, she saw now, were not filled with hate. They were filled with a piercing intelligence. He held up his hand, not in threat, but in a gesture for her to wait. He turned and called out an order. One warrior brought forward the carcass of a freshly killed deer. Another brought a beautifully woven blanket. Kalen turned back to her. He pointed at the gifts, then at Nantan. Finally, his gaze met hers, and he placed a closed fist over his heart. "A thank you." A wave of relief so powerful, it almost buckled her knees, washed over Abigail. They weren't here for revenge. They were here to honor a debt. But just as the relief began to settle, Kalen's expression shifted. The solemn gratitude was replaced by something harder, more urgent. He held up his hand again, and this time he was holding something small and metallic, the spent rifle cartridge she had found next to the dead arsonist. He looked from the cartridge to the Winchester leaning against her door frame, then back to her. His eyes were not grateful now. They were questioning, accusing. He wasn't just here to thank her. He was here for an answer. The air on the porch crackled with tension. Kalen held the cartridge pinched between his thumb and forefinger, an unspoken question hanging between them. Abigail could only shake her head, trying to convey her innocence. It was Nantan who broke the standoff. He slid off his pony and ran to his father's side, speaking rapidly in their tongue. He pointed at Abigail, then made a gesture of pulling, mimicking the rescue from the quicksand. He pointed to the charred barn wall, making a shape like fire with his hands. Then he pointed to the empty space where the dead man had lain, and finally, he pointed to Abigail's rifle and shook his head vigorously. He was telling the story. He was telling them she hadn't fired the shot. Kalen listened, his eyes never leaving Abigail's face. When Nantan finished, the chief's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He dropped the cartridge into the dust. The accusation was dismissed. But the urgency remained. He pointed, not toward his own lands in the northeast, but to the west, toward Silas Croft's ranch. He spoke again, his tone sharp, angry. He made a gesture like a snake slithering, then a motion like water being choked off. He swept his arm across the valley, encompassing her homestead and the lands beyond. Water. Stopped. The west. Croft. The meaning crashed down on Abigail with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just her small plot of land he was after. He was damming the creek. That creek was the lifeblood of everything downstream. For her, it was the difference between survival and ruin. For Collins people who relied on the seasonal waters that fed their hunting grounds, it was a sentence of death. Croft wasn't just stealing water. He was waging a silent, merciless war. She finally understood the full scope of his greed. By damming the creek on the vast tracts of land he controlled upstream, he would starve her out, forcing her to sell for pennies. At the same time, he would turn the Apache lands into a barren wasteland, driving them out of the territory for good. It was a brutally efficient, two-pronged attack. She looked from Callan's hard face to the 50 warriors sitting silently on their horses. Their presence was no longer a threat, but a statement. They hadn't come just to thank her. Their search for Nantan had led them down the valley, where their scouts had discovered Croft's construction. They had found the source of their slow, dying land, and then they had found their son's tracks leading to the one other person standing in Croft's way. Kalen spoke again, his voice low and urgent. He pointed to her, then to himself. He drew a line in the dirt between them. Then he stabbed his finger toward the west, toward the source of their shared problem. You and I, against him. The idea was insane. An alliance with the Apache. The settlers in the nearest town would call it treason. The army would call her a renegade. She would be utterly alone, an outcast from her own world. But what was the alternative? Face Croft and his hired guns by herself. She knew how that story ended. A mysterious fire in the night. A stray bullet. Croft would get her land one way or another. He had left her no choice. She looked at Nantan, who was watching her with an intense, hopeful expression. She looked at the small wooden hawk she had placed on her porch rail, a tangible piece of the bridge built between her and this boy. She had pulled him from the earth that was now being threatened. Their fates were intertwined. Abigail met Kalen's gaze, her own resolve hardening into steel. She gave a single, sharp nod. Yes. A murmur went through the assembled warriors. Kalen's stoic expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect. He issued a series of commands. The Apache dismounted, moving with quiet, disciplined efficiency. They were not a chaotic mob. They were a seasoned military unit. Some led the horses to the creek, while others established a perimeter, melting into the landscape as if they were born from it. Abigail's small farm was transformed into an armed camp. Later, As a plan began to form through a combination of gestures and drawings in the dirt, Nantan revealed one more piece of the puzzle. The reason he had been alone, the reason he'd stumbled into the quicksand, was not so simple. He had been tracking something. He had seen Croft's men meeting with another group, not settlers. Men with strange tools and spyglasses who looked at the land not as a home, but as a series of lines on a map. Railroad men. Croft's plan was even bigger than they imagined. The dam wasn't just for him. It was the first step in a grand scheme to clear the whole territory, to make way for the Iron Horse. That night, as the unfamiliar scent of Apache cooking fires mingled with the smoke from her own chimney, Abigail Reed stood on her porch, watching warriors sharpening blades and checking their rifles. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. Her fate was now tied to that of Kalen and his people. She had bought herself a chance at survival, but she had also invited a war to her front door. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the war was coming. The alliance was less than a day old when Silas Croft made his move. He must have had scouts watching, because the speed of his response was terrifying. Just after dawn, a lookout's sharp cry cut through the morning air. Bo Garrett was coming, but this time he had 20 men with him. They weren't coming to talk. They rode hard and fast, rifles already drawn, fanning out as they approached. Croft had seen the alliance as a declaration of war. He had sent his men not to threaten, but to exterminate. Kalen issued sharp, guttural commands. His warriors didn't panic. They melted back into prepared positions behind the stone walls of the corral and among the rocky outcrops. In seconds, the bustling camp vanished, leaving only an eerie silence. Kalen turned to Abigail, who stood on her porch, her Winchester in hand. He pointed to the cabin. "Stay inside. Defend from there." She ran inside, securing the door just as the first shots erupted. Garrett's men charged forward, whooping and firing from the saddle, expecting to ride down a disorganized camp. Instead, they were met with a disciplined volley of fire that seemed to come from the very earth itself. 2 of Croft's men were knocked from their saddles before they were halfway across the pasture. The charge faltered, the riders thrown into confusion. Abigail rested her rifle on the windowsill, took a deep breath, and drew a bead on a rider scrambling for cover. Jedediah had taught her to squeeze the trigger, not jerk it. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man cried out, clutching his arm as his horse bolted. The battle for Reed's hope had begun. It was a chaotic, terrifying symphony of violence. Bullets thudded into the log walls of her cabin, sending splinters flying. One smashed through the window pane, showering her with glass. She ducked, her heart pounding, then cautiously raised her head to fire again. She fought with a cold, focused fury. This was her home. These men were the physical manifestation of the greed that sought to destroy everything she had. Through the smoke she could see Kalen, moving like a phantom, directing his warriors with hand signals. His men would fire from one position, then crawl unseen to another, creating the illusion of a much larger force. Garrett, realizing his charge had been a disastrous miscalculation, ordered his men to dismount and take cover. The battle devolved into a brutal siege. The sun climbed higher. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. She saw one of Kalen's warriors go down, struck in the leg, and 2 others drag him back to the creek bed. The sight solidified her resolve. These men were now bleeding on her land, for her land. Late in the afternoon, Garrett tried a new tactic. He and 2 of his men made a desperate rush for the barn, intending to set it ablaze and use the fire to cover a final assault. Abigail saw them coming. "No, you don't," she snarled, shifting to the side window. She fired. The first man stumbled and fell. The second hesitated, and in that moment, An arrow hissed through the air and embedded itself in his shoulder. Only Garrett was left, a lit torch in his hand. He was almost to the barn. Abigail lined up her shot, but another rifle cracked from a different position before she could fire. Garrett cried out, the torch flying from his hand as he was struck in the side. He staggered, then scrambled back toward cover. The attack was broken. As dusk settled, the last of Croft's men retreated, carrying their wounded and leaving 4 of their dead behind. It was a victory, but a costly one. Callan had lost 1 warrior. 3 others were wounded. The homestead was scarred with bullet holes. In the quiet aftermath, Abigail emerged from her cabin, her ears ringing. She looked at Callan, who was standing over the body of his fallen warrior, his face a mask of grim sorrow. They had won the battle. But Silas Croft was not a man to accept defeat. He would be back, and next time, he would come with everything he had. The fight for survival had now moved to its final, desperate stage. They had to take the battle to him. That night they captured one of Croft's wounded men who'd been left behind. Under Callan's intense questioning, the man broke. He confirmed their worst fears. The dam was nearly complete. They had maybe 1 day left before the water was cut off for good. And he revealed something else. Croft was expecting a shipment in 2 days' time, not just supplies, but a dozen more hired guns, professional enforcers sent by the railroad. Their small victory had only started a countdown to their own annihilation. There was no other option. They had to hit the dam. Now, in the flickering firelight of the War Council, Callan laid out an audacious, almost suicidal plan. He would lead the main body of his warriors on a treacherous high route, scaling the cliffs behind the dam site to attack where they were least expected. But Croft's men were on high alert. They needed a diversion, a big one. The mission fell to Abigail. She and a handful of Callan's best marksmen would take up a position on a ridge overlooking the main canyon trail, the only direct approach to the dam. They were to make enough noise to convince Croft that a full-scale assault was coming from the front. She was to be the bait. An hour before dawn, they rode out. The Apache warriors moved like shadows, leading her up a steep, rocky game trail to the ridge. As the sun's first rays illuminated the canyon, she saw the dam site below. It was a hive of activity. At least 30 men, led by Croft himself and a wounded, limping Bo Garrett, were working to fortify their position. The creek was already choked off, its water forming a dead, muddy pool behind the massive timber structure. The sight of it filled her with a righteous fury. Callan's plan depended on timing. He needed the chaos to be at its peak when his warriors descended from the cliffs. Abigail took her position, looked at the 5 warriors beside her, and gave them a grim nod. The diversion began with a volley of war cries from the valley floor, a small group of warriors sent to create the initial disturbance. As expected, Garrett sent a large force of a dozen men to investigate. That was her signal. Abigail took a deep, steadying breath, aimed not at a man, but at Garrett's feet, and fired. The bullet kicked up dust right in front of him, sowing immediate confusion. Her next shot shattered a lantern near Croft, and chaos erupted as her companions added their fire. The shots came from an impossible distance, echoing through the canyon, making their small group sound like an army. Croft's men were pinned down, firing wildly at enemies they couldn't see. As the fake battle raged below, Callan's warriors descended the cliffs behind the dam like ghosts. They fell upon the dam's few remaining guards with silent, deadly efficiency. The men were dispatched before they could even raise an alarm. Realizing they'd been tricked, Croft's men turned back toward the dam, but it was too late. From her vantage point, Abigail saw Croft, his face contorted in rage, raise a pistol and aim it squarely at Callan, who was now exposed on the dam structure. There was no time to think. She aimed, compensated for the wind and the distance, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was true. Croft cried out and stumbled, dropping his pistol, a dark stain spreading on his shoulder. In the ensuing mayhem, a vengeful Beau Garrett made one last, desperate charge toward the Apache leader, only to be cut down by Kalen's warriors. With the guards neutralized, the Apache axes bit deep into the dam's main supports. There was a groan of tortured timber, a sound like the world breaking in half. Then, with a triumphant roar, the structure gave way. A wall of water, the lifeblood of the valley, surged forward. It was a torrent of life and destruction, washing away the remnants of Silas Croft's greed, sweeping his camp and his broken men down the canyon. The creek was free. Later, Kalen met her at the base of the ridge. His men had secured the site and taken Croft and the few remaining survivors prisoner. He faced Abigail, looked at the liberated water rushing past them, and then back at her. Without a word, he placed his fist over his heart. It wasn't just a thank you anymore. It was a gesture of shared victory, of respect forged in blood and gunpowder. 3 days later, the Apache departed. They melted back into the landscape, leaving the valley in peace. Nantan, riding beside his father, turned and waved a final goodbye. Abigail stood on her scarred porch, the small wooden hawk clutched in her hand. Her home was battered, but it was still standing. Her life was irrevocably changed. But as she listened to the sound of the running creek, a sound she thought she might never hear again, she felt a profound and resilient hope. Abigail and Kalen's story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest divides can be bridged by a single act of compassion, and the strongest alliances are forged not in boardrooms, but in the shared dust and desperation of a common fight. The Old West was a land of conflict, but it was also a place where honor and bravery could be found in the most unexpected of people. If this story of bravery, survival, and the unlikely bonds forged in the fires of the frontier moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful, character-driven story. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more tales from the Untamed West to share, and we don't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for watching.